Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, body positivity, and health at every size. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and certified intuitive eating counselor specializing in weight-inclusive wellness. Join me as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food.
I remember I was teething, little gums bleeding, cried every evening, it was all about eating. When I became a teen, it was all about beef, and now I'm ready for the world. Trying to sink my teeth in, stacking extra cheese.
Hey there, welcome to episode 102 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with Lindsay Stenovec, a fellow body positive and health at every size dietitian who is the owner of Nutrition Instincts private practice and the founder of the Nurtured Mama community. And she has a mission to help women and mothers reduce their stress and guilt around food and movement by helping them restore their trust in their bodies and their intuition and taking weight obsession out of the equation. She's such a great guest, and we had a really amazing conversation about different stages of life can bring on different challenges for women, especially around puberty and pregnancy and the postpartum period. So I get a lot of requests from people asking for resources for pregnancy and postpartum, and this is a great episode for that. We really get into it, and Lindsay also has some amazing resources in this area that she'll share with you at the end of the episode. So stay tuned, and I can't wait to share it in just a moment. In order to support our podcast, we need the help of some great advertisers. And in order to find great advertisers, we need to learn a little bit more about you, our listeners. So if you would help us out and go to podsurvey.com/foodpsych and take a quick anonymous survey that will help us get to know you a little better. That way we can show advertisers just how great our listeners are, because you seriously are the best. And I want to make sure we're matched up with advertisers that really fit the mission of body positivity and health at every size, and giving resources for people to improve their relationships with food, and also resources that maybe have nothing to do with food and body, and that are just fun, interesting things that you guys like. So I would love it if you would take the survey. And even if you've taken a podcast listener survey before for another podcast, this one is specific to our show, so we really need you to take it too. Plus, once you've completed the survey, you can enter to win a $100 Amazon gift card. That's a pretty cool incentive, right? So take the survey at podsurvey.com/foodpsych. That's podsurvey.com/foodpsych. If you haven't gotten it yet, you can grab my free guide for 7 simple strategies to help you make peace with food and your body. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. Or you can also text the phone number 44222 if you're in the US with the word food psych, all one word. So that's the number 44222 and then the word food psych to get my free guide. If you like the podcast and you want to help us reach more people who need to hear the health at every size, intuitive eating message, you can share the podcast on iTunes. That's a great way to help get the word out. So if you're listening to an episode on your phone, you can just go to the little 3 dots in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, click that, and then click on Share Episode at the bottom of the menu. And if you're listening from iTunes on your computer, just click on the drop-down menu at the right of each episode, and that will allow you to share it too. All right, without any further ado, let's go talk to Lindsay Stenovec. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
Yes. So, one thing I'll say, even before jumping into this, I feel that your podcast has been such a gift to not only, I think, all of your listeners, but also to the health at every size professionals and our community.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think my story sounds so similar to many of the stories that I've been able to listen to of my colleagues. And, I've been saying, you should run a study on all of us and, the progression that we've all kind of gone through from early childhood, up onto our professional experiences. So yeah, like many have shared, my relationship with food was pretty great when I was a kid. I don't have many thoughts from my early childhood around food. Luckily, I had parents who knew enough, or it was a value of theirs to not make us finish everything on our plate or overly push certain foods. And I don't even think it was anything that they had read or learned. That's just kind of how they did it.
That's nice.
It was nice. Yeah, it was really nice. I like have this memory when I was a young child in a town called Solvang, and
Oh, I know Solvang.
you know Solvang.
Yeah, I'm from Northern California, but whenever we
Oh,
would
that's
drive
right.
down south, we would go past it. And I was always like, what is this Solvang place?
Yeah, it's like a funny, it's a Dutch town.
Mm-hmm.
It's really kind of a fun place to visit. And I remember the waitress at this place that we went to, at this meal I had ordered, it had these peas on it and they just didn't look very good. So I didn't eat them. And I remember her saying like, oh, honey, like I can't take that plate until you eat your peas. And I remember
Oh,
thinking, that lady's nuts. Like, I don't know what she's talking about, but like, I'm not going to eat these peas. And like, it was like this thing that stood out in my mind because it was something I like no one had ever told me before. I just thought she was nuts.
that's so funny.
It was, yeah, it's such a funny memory of mine. So, overall, healthy relationship with food as a young kid. I do remember having plenty of body conscious thoughts, certainly starting at a young age. They weren't really connected to my relationship with food. But, as a younger girl, I was a dancer and a competitive gymnast. So two areas that you would, that kind of like send up red flags sometimes when it comes to body image and
Totally.
food and things like that. And, I was really lucky. I had a dance instructor and a coaches for my gymnastics team that were really protective when it came to, I mean, not in any way, they didn't necessarily have discussions about it with us directly, but just the way they ran their programs and costumes and the way they talked about teamwork and things like that. I think I was really lucky to be in two environments that could have been really risky that were pretty sound. But even with that, I spent most of my time in front of a mirror. I oftentimes was dancing with older girls that were older than me. And so I do remember like wanting to look like them, some of these like kind of typical puberty related things. But again, nothing too intense until puberty hit. And this was around, I was still a competitive gymnast at the time. And when I think back to when things really started to change for me, it really was around puberty. And I didn't know it at the time. I didn't even know it until my more recent experiences with postpartum depression and anxiety, and having kind of a look back on my life and really understanding my own things that I went through growing up, that with puberty really came anxiety for me. And I remember a very distinct shift in my mindset around gymnastics in particular and my skills and my ability to do these skills and to, it's a very much both a very physically tasking and mentally tasking sport. And if you can't keep your fears in kind of check around different, new moves and things like that, it's really difficult to progress. And I just have this memory of all of a sudden, everything I was doing at gymnastics became very scary. And, I just started to have symptoms of anxiety that, I had no idea at the time, but coincidentally as well, definitely body thoughts started to increase around that time. And, the anxiety actually caused me to eventually want to quit gymnastics because it just wasn't fun anymore. But it was also good timing for me in terms of like my life and moving on to high school and things like that. But in terms of the body thoughts, I just remember feeling more and more self-conscious about my own body, and a friend, making a comment about counting fat grams and starting to make those connections slowly, that, oh, there's like this connection with body dissatisfaction and counting things. And of course, this was in the 90s. And that was a huge like fat phobia in terms of the nutritional fat.
Yeah, dietary fat was the demon that now is associated with other things today. But
Right. So I remember that kind of planting a not so helpful seed. And I hadn't really heard much about like dieting growing up. My mom knew enough, to not talk about it in front of us, even though she had, totally experimented with it growing up and even on and off, I think probably while raising us, like many women do. She never brought it, we never knew that.
So did you see like books around and she was eating differently, or was it kind of like she ate the same as you guys and it was never obvious?
She totally ate the same as us, and I actually don't even know. I mean, it was really like conversations we've had now as adults, like just kind of talking about it, reflecting on it. At least when I was at that age, and my mom had a pretty when she always tells a story of when she had us, it really actually healed her own like relationship with food in her body, and that was something I always kind of thought about and thought was really interesting once I was older and knew that. So not everyone has that experience, but for her, it was that way. So yeah, around eighth or ninth grade, I'd say that's when, as my body started to change drastically, I was no longer a competitive gymnast. That really kind of got puberty moving, like a hormonal perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I know in gymnastics, a lot of sort of elite gymnasts will delay puberty because they're exercising so much,
Mhm.
like they're doing so much gymnastics that it stunts their development.
Yeah, that's definitely something that can happen. And I have no idea. I wasn't elite, I was at the competitive level, but I've always wondered that. Like, did everything kind of start a little bit later for me because of that? Which totally could be the case, or it could have just been the natural timing for my body.
Right. It's hard to know.
I don't know. It's hard to know. It's hard to know, but that's definitely something that does happen.
Hmm. And like weight gain and, getting more body fat is so essential for women going through puberty. It's like we have to have that happen in order to be able to menstruate, in order to have normal hormonal function. So it's such a common, I mean, I'm always saying on the podcast, like, this is normal, talk to your kids, because if a kid is going through that and they're getting all these messages from diet culture and feeling like, oh yeah, I'm gaining weight and that's bad because, everything around me is telling me that's bad and I should try to lose weight. There really isn't a lot of message to counter that in our culture, that like this is normal and you have to go through this in order to achieve an adult body. I mean, I think there's also like so much incentive to maintain a pre-adolescent body, right? Like that's the body that's held up as the feminine beauty ideal, which is just nuts.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the idea that somehow got planted that we're supposed to have the same like body and weight as we did in high school, like for the rest of our lives, like this thing that's placed on women. Or, I think about the way I only had sisters, so I have two younger sisters, but my friend had a brother and we were all very close. And it's like when boys go through puberty and they're like eating a ton of food because they need a ton of food because they have higher nutritional needs.
Right.
The reaction from a cultural perspective is like, oh, he's a growing boy.
Right.
Like, oh, he's eating us out of house and home. Like, oh,
Oh, isn't that
let's
funny?
get him more
Yeah.
food, like, oh, la, 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 la. It's like totally just like, it's accepted. It's a normal thing because it is a normal thing. But then as women, we're going through, certainly the changes are different, but we're going through changes that increase our nutritional needs drastically. And we do need to have, additional body fat and all these changes that are going on. And we get the complete opposite message from a cultural perspective. And you really never hear anyone exclaim like, "Oh, she's a growing girl. Like she needs a lot of food."
Right. Like, oh, she's eating us out of house and home. Like, isn't that cute?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. No, there's this cultural stigma on it that starts so young. And if it hasn't started by the beginning of puberty, it's definitely going to start then. Like, people will start saying those messages to you. And it's just really insidious. I think that's such a good point, that like we really celebrate, boys' appetites at that age and girls' appetites, which are of necessity also larger because they're growing and having to accumulate body fat, are shamed. And then of course there's, if someone is trans and they're going through puberty, that's a whole other level of like having to question and, wanting to delay puberty or change the process. And that brings up a whole lot for people too, which is what I've read and heard, that the trans population has such a higher incidence of eating disorders, and it often starts around puberty when they start developing the sex characteristics of the gender that they don't identify with.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Puberty is a tough time for everyone.
Puberty is a tough time for everyone. It really is, especially when what you're going through is not something that is celebrated necessarily culturally. That is just the normal thing that you're going through, but you're not getting that message as clearly as you deserve to and need to hear that.
I feel like it's like a time of like enormous straight gender male privilege, because pretty much that's the only identity that where it is celebrated, like, oh, what your body's doing is normal, and everybody else who doesn't fit that identity is having a lot of shame placed on them.
Yep, absolutely. And I think my own experience as a woman during that time, I was at you were too, we were at the binge eating disorder conference, and Dana and Hillary shared a quote. I want to say it was an Anita Johnston quote. It could have been Peggy Ornstein, but it was someone, and I hope I'm not misquoting someone, but they talked about how, in puberty, we learn to care more about our desirability than our desires. And when I heard that quote, it just really, I just got this memory of like, yeah, I totally remember when that was an internalized message for me, that I internalized that message. I remember, I have this memory of being in a hall in high school, and I went from like middle school not having many curves to like, and I really wanted curves, to then I had plenty of curves and boobs and all these things. And I remember a friend from my childhood making this comment towards me and like looking at me differently and thinking like, it's a little exciting, but mostly I'm freaked out. Like I just didn't even know how to take that. And that was like the memory that kind of popped into my head when Hillary and Dana shared that quote. I was just thinking that's so right on.
Oh yeah.
A message that I could totally resonate with and affects us in many more ways, obviously, than just physically.
Totally. Yeah. The transition into like an adult woman body and sort of traditional femininity is the transition into being desired and sort of caring more about being desired than about your own desires. Like that's the pressure that's put on you, and that's the expectation that's put on you.
Right.
And it takes years for so many people to come out of that. I mean, I definitely remember that transition for myself too, where like I had always felt awkward. I had always, I had like moved schools when I was 10 and felt like an outcast at the new school for a long time, and kind of was nerdy and like, just it was hard for me socially. And so then when I went through puberty and started getting attention from my body, I was like, yes, acceptance. Like, this is good. Let me hang on to this. Let me try to do what I can to further this, which is, it's funny because I've just really been thinking recently about all the little ways that manifested, because I didn't develop an eating disorder until later. I didn't think at all about food as it related to my body size back then, although I did sometimes, have qualms about my body changing shape and stuff. But the way it really manifested for me was these sort of other markers of like femininity, or what I was told was feminine. Like I started dyeing my hair blonde, and I plucked my eyebrows to this extreme degree because it was the 90s, and like the tiny eyebrow was in, and I had naturally very thick eyebrows. And so I just like started going down this road of like changing my body in all of these ways that had nothing to do with food or size, but that still were kind of playing right into the same dynamic. Like it set me up in a way to be in a culture that was asking that of me. It was like, of course, the next logical step was eventually I would also start playing with diets and, trying to manipulate my size, because I was already trying to manipulate all these other things about myself.
Yeah, that's such an articulate way to describe the connections, that the way all of this connects, that we don't experience food and body stuff in a bubble. And these messages affect us in so many ways and manifest in so many ways as we develop as individuals.
That's why I think feminism is such an important part of this conversation, and, social justice and gender equality like have to be a part of the conversation, because it's not in a bubble. It's not like you can just fix your relationship with food and your body, and all of these other things aren't still going to be constant pressures on you in society. Like, not that we have to all never change anything about ourselves or that it's bad to like wear makeup or change your hair color or anything like that. But I think thinking critically about it and thinking about where it came from is important, and realizing like, okay, here are some aspects of patriarchy that maybe are choices I want to make because this seems appealing to me. I like wearing makeup, or I like wearing certain types of clothes, and that's okay. You know, we're all free to make our own choices. But I think if you sort of uncritically just take in the choices and feel like they're yours without reflecting on what of this is mine and what of this is from patriarchy and diet culture, I think that's where you get into trouble.
Absolutely. Having that critical thought process around it, I think, is key. And the outcome is going to be different for everyone. That's been something I've been thinking about a lot lately of like, okay, like how far down the rabbit hole do you go? And at what point, you want to make sure you're making the decisions that you want to be making, and really having clarity around what the intentions are.
Yeah.
And what the expected outcome is too. Because it's really difficult to figure out. And I get that question a lot from clients of like, okay, so if we like move towards this whole acceptance and like, body positivity thing, like, am I allowed to wear like makeup? Should I just like get out of the shower and not dry my hair? Like what
Right.
should I just wear like, a bag over my body? Like how do I figure out what's mine? What do I want? And what's been imposed on me, and what do I not want? And again, I think that's going to look different for everyone. Like it could be all of those things for some people, and it could be very different for others. So it's super interesting topic. And one that probably would serve us quite well that, when we have discussions in school about puberty and, the changes we're going through, to have really honest and open conversations about these topics, that it's not just about like, here's some deodorant.
Right.
Like we could learn a few more things. And there's so many parallels, which I'll get to in a minute, but so many parallels I see with our transition into, at least for females, into motherhood, with the like, like, let me teach you how to change a diaper. Let's get you ready for this baby. It's like, no, like I can figure that part out. Thank you. That's really not what I needed. Now looking back, it was not what I needed.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
In terms of the prep involved, and let's just keep it surface level.
Right. There's so many deeper things going on that we're not really prepared for, or that aren't discussed in a meaningful way in the public space.
Right. Absolutely.
Oh, so interesting. And Margot Main, I think it is, who wrote a book about women in midlife and the sort of pressures that women in midlife and going through menopause face, and eating disorders in that population. But she has this presentation she does about like different phases of a woman's life that are all vulnerable points for developing an eating disorder or body image concerns. And it's like puberty, motherhood, menopause are kind of the big three.
Oh, yeah.
And, it does really make a lot of sense, because those are the times when our body's really changing and it feels a little out of control. And then there are these cultural messages being like, and you're bad for having your body change in this way, even though it's actually super normal development. And these are super important life stages and, changes for the body to make. If you choose to be a mother, like you have to gain weight in pregnancy, and it's not realistic to lose weight really fast, and same with puberty. You have to gain weight in puberty to support normal female hormonal function. And in menopause, you're supposed to gain weight around your midsection in order to keep from having such severe symptoms of menopause. Like that actually, the Margot Main says a lot of people think of it as a spare tire, but it's actually a life preserver. Like it's helping you sustain life and keep you from having these terrible menopause symptoms that some people experience because they have estrogen drop really rapidly.
I love that. I've heard that before. And yeah, her books are on my list.
Mm-hmm.
I really want to dive into her work, to hear her speak a little at IDEP.
Yeah. Yeah. She's such an amazing speaker.
Yeah. Yeah. I love her voice. I love listening to her talk.
I know. I know.
The way she articulates. She just, had some really beautiful things to say, really powerful things to say.
And it's so important to think about these things, because these are life stages that really affect us. And to be sort of able to anticipate it and know what's coming is so key, I think.
Right. Absolutely. And affects our families too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm a big proponent of, I like to say, yes, like, okay, I'm going to contradict myself real quick. So on one hand, I love the quote of put your oxygen mask on before you put the oxygen mask on of like the child with you, in the event of a plane crash, all that stuff. And that's so true. Obviously, once you are a parent, there is everything you do to a degree is going to impact, your family. And you always have that in the back of your mind, I think. And with decision making, that can be quite overwhelming. But at the same time, we also forget that we are just inherently valuable human beings all on our own. That we deserve self-care and we deserve lots of, things because we're human beings. We're valuable human beings, whether or not we're caring for anyone else. Because there was a time when we were not parents. And we were valuable then too, right? Like, obviously. And so it's just this interesting thing. I see it a lot. I mean, a lot of my work is with women. And so that tends to be what I bring up. But, it might be the case for others as well. But when you think about helping moms take care of themselves, a lot of the messaging is like, you have to take care of yourself so you can take care of your kids. That's true. That's totally true. And I would never argue with that. At the same time, is that the only way that moms are going to agree to like stop and care for themselves and get support and pay for therapy or like whatever they need? Is that the only way that happens? So again, I always kind of contradict myself because I'm like, that's a powerful way, certainly. And it's something that I think triggers a lot of us to get help in certain ways because we see the impact it could have on others. And at the same time, it's like, I also kind of wish it was like the norm to just get support when we need it, regardless of that part, and to realize that we're valuable human beings, like kind of all on our own.
Yeah, because I think that part is, the realizing you're valuable on your own is kind of the key to sustaining recovery. Like maybe it'll drive you in the door to think like I don't want to be missing out on my child's life, or I want to be present for them, or I don't want to like, instill in them the same unhealthy behaviors that I've been participating in. But at a certain point, you have to make changes for yourself. It's not going to stick. It's not going to be enough if it's just for the kids or for your family or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, it's both. Yeah. So getting back to your story, like, did you said you sort of made it through okay with the early part of puberty. Did diet culture start to take hold at some point in high school, or was it later that you started to struggle, or how did that play out?
Yeah, definitely right around that 9th grade year, as I started experiencing those changes and, experienced attention or lack thereof from men, either or, depending on who it was and what was going on. And, I didn't really have there was no diet that I specifically tried at the time, but I just remember having this sort of kind of chronic thought process of like, I should eat less. I should just try to eat less. And I kind of went on my quote, like first diet. Again, just there wasn't necessarily a name for it around, I'm pretty sure it was summer of 9th grade. And just like Evelyn Triboulet talks about with that first diet, it was pretty easy. And I did experience changes, quite unfortunately, when you think about, at any point in our lives, but especially at a time when your body should not be changing in that way. Having induced weight loss during a time when your body's supposed to be growing and gaining weight, that's quite dangerous. And I do remember getting that reinforcement from girls at school and coming back my sophomore year. I'd say that is really when things just, all of that was terribly reinforcing to get positive feedback coming back from that summer. And that's pretty much when I would say my real battle with food and body started, kind of starting to trigger those more obsessive thoughts. Classic response to deprivation would be the increase in obsessive thoughts, right, around food and this constant dialogue of what I should be eating, what I shouldn't be eating, what am I going to eat? And I remember my senior year, I had a boyfriend at the time. I remember him saying hey, I'm concerned. You seem to bring this up a lot. or when we go out to eat, like, you talk about this. And I remember totally shutting him down, like, hey, this is going to be my area of study, because I had already gotten into Cal Poly. You declare your major when you go there. And I had applied to be a nutrition major and got in there. I was like, this is just what I like. Like, this is my interest. And just like you like to talk about the things you're interested in, this is what I'm interested in. So I totally shut him down. And, I really should go back and say thank you to him for at least trying just to bring it up and to really be honest about his concerns. I really wish I would have stopped and really thought about that more, because as I transitioned into college, things really spiraled. I know now I was dealing with depression and anxiety throughout my college experience as well. I think, on one hand, college was this like incredible, amazing experience where, I loved living in San Luis Obispo. I made amazing friends that I still have today. And I had plenty of fun, probably too much fun sometimes. But there are so many great memories that I have from that time. But then on the other hand, when I think about what was going on in my own thoughts and my own struggle with food and body, it was really different than what people were seeing on the outside. I really struggled a lot internally. There was it was really difficult for me to go from my high school experience where I felt like everyone knew me really well and I knew them really well. These are all very close friends. They know you. And I remember having a lot of anxiety around like first impressions and will they understand who I am? And what if I do something quote wrong? And, they will hate me, because of the first impression. And I remember those very clear thoughts. So the transition into my freshman year was pretty hard on me. And I also remember it really standing out that these men in the dorms, a lot of the guys had pictures of various women on their walls.
Oh God, I remember that.
It just really stood out to me, which is surprising. I mean, I guess it's not surprising, but it really, in a quite literal way, made me feel like I was not going to be good enough for these guys, that I needed to look this way, which obviously is like not something that's realistic.
Right.
These are airbrushed photos. These are supermodels. These are like whatever it is. And you have to think about it too, from what we tell straight male college-aged men, like they were just kind of consuming the culture just like the rest of us. These were all nice, fun guys, they, some became friends, but this was just kind of what was quote normalized.
Oh my God, totally. I remember that too. It's funny because I had guy friends in high school and never really seen that from them. And then going to the dorms as well. I remember like specifically like 3 or 4 guys on our floor had like pictures of calendar photos or like Sports Illustrated models or whatever on their walls. And it was the same feeling. I was like, oh, I'm not good enough. Like this is what I'm supposed to look like. And it was a very interesting distillation of that message. Yeah, I don't know. That's funny that you mentioned that, because I'm just remembering that it felt very similar to me too.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing. It was nice guys who were just kind of playing the role that they were supposed to play. Like, I don't think they were out to objectify women. It was just patriarchy just kind of asks certain things of men that they will sometimes buy into without thinking about it. So
right.
That's what that was.
Right. Yeah. And having grown up with sisters, I just didn't know, was this something that was going on when I was in high school? Is this what guys are looking for? Like, it was just this whole new world in conjunction with all of the change and not having anyone that well or that they know, it's just a one big perfect storm. We need a lot of support in that transition as well that we're not getting appropriately.
It's a super hard transition to go from living with your parents and having ostensibly some structure and some support at home to just like kind of chaos. Like it felt very chaotic to me and just like fun and super social. But like I've later realized about myself that I'm an introvert, and I'm a very extroverted introvert. I love talking with people. I love connecting, but I get drained by it and I need time away to recuperate. And I didn't have that. I lived in a triple room. It was actually supposed to be a double. It was sized for a double, but they squeezed 3 people in there. So I never was without at least one roommate around. And then our floor was super social, and everybody, there was probably like, 50 people on the floor or something, or 20, I don't know, 30 people maybe, hanging out constantly in someone's room or in the hallway outside my room, just talking till late at night. And it was like impossible to get that sort of downtime and recuperation. And so I had a lot of anxiety and sort of symptoms of overwhelm that first year that, of course, then I blamed myself for. Like, I had a hard time smiling. It was a very strange thing where I felt like every time I smiled, it was fake. And then I started judging myself for it and got really in my head about it. And then like that just compounded the problem, It's like,
I can totally relate to that. I think especially many of us in this profession, we found this profession because we're, I consider myself like a highly sensitive person where, quote,
same.
like quote, like the title,
Right.
where you really pick up on other people's emotions and, you really take that on. And I think, being in that environment, being someone who is more extroverted, but yes, drained by that because it's so much to take on, because certainly you and I were not the only people struggling on those floors. So everyone's going to going through their own struggles. And it's a lot to take on. And you're so right about that. Just like no downtime.
Yeah, it's tough. And I think a lot of people at that age don't really know that about themselves because they've never had to sort of experience it. Like, I socialized a lot in high school, but I always had my own room to come back to. I was, had a curfew, so I was never out that late. So I kind of always had like some downtime in my room at home before going to bed and just like time to restore. And that was not the case in college, but nobody prepared me for that.
Yes, that's so true.
Yeah. So how did that affect your relationship with your body and food at that point?
So in short, the 4.5 years I was in college was, for the larger part of that time, was just sort of this chronic struggle with wanting my body to look and do a certain thing in response to the way that I ate, and never finding that it did what I expected or wanted it to do. So just a complete disconnection from my internal cues, frustration with hunger. I mean, I thought hunger was like a malfunction of my body was malfunctioning.
Yeah.
In our education, it didn't help.
No.
At all. And I know a lot of us have talked about that. I'm sure it was mentioned at one point, but not obviously in a way that got through to me, because I do not remember anyone talking about intuitive eating or hunger and fullness cues. Well, I'm quite certain the words intuitive eating never came out of any of the classes, but hey, how hungry are you? Or should you consider that when you're working with your clients? To me, all I heard was monitor, count, be a certain weight.
This amount of calories should satisfy you. So if you're hungry beyond that, it's a craving. It's not actual hunger.
Yes, that cravings are bad is definitely something I work on a lot with clients. And, this caused a lot of disordered eating for me. I think I was never diagnosed with an eating disorder. I wish I had reached out to get help. I remember I did have one professor who was an eating disorder specialist, and I was a peer health educator in my senior year. And I just knew, like, I was thinking about food way too much. I just didn't realize it was something I could get help with necessarily. Like, I was very confused. And I remember thinking, should I just ask her if this is a weird thing to be experiencing? And I never did, but I wish I could go back and just tell myself, go and talk to someone. It wasn't until my senior year, I was sitting in I forget the title of the class. So basically we were having a discussion about portions. And I remember out of nowhere, I just blurted out, "Oh, the portions on the box are just a unit of measure. They're not the amount that's right for everyone." And everyone looked at me like I had 8 heads and turned back around, and the professor just sort of kept talking. And that was the moment I started calling bullshit on our education, because that just sort of that little moment for me where I started to own my own experience with food and how confused I was when I followed that darn portion on this stupid cereal box, and it didn't work out for me, clearly, because it was nowhere near enough food.
Right.
That it wasn't the amount that was supposed to be right for my body. Like it was just a plain old unit of measure, which turns out, had nothing to do with the amount that I was supposed to be eating. I mean, it was really not based in any amount of polling of human beings or whatever. I mean, it's just a arbitrary number that they pick.
Right. Of what actually satisfies people. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's also, I've learned along the way too, that because now there's so much healthism in our culture and so much focus on calories and nutrition, companies will actually manipulate the serving size to get it to look like there are fewer calories. Like if a serving size that would actually satisfy someone seems to have, an amount of calories that would scare people or something, if they saw it on the box, they'll adjust the serving size so that it looks like, oh, this is like a diet food.
Yes.
So that's like something to think about too. It's like the sort of arbitrary assigning of serving sizes has no basis in what's actually going to satisfy people. And this concern with calories is completely misguided as well, because calories don't function the same way in the human body that they do in the lab. And you can't ever know how many calories an individual is going to need, except by letting them respond to their hunger and fullness cues once those are back online.
Oh, that's such a good point. And especially as we start diving more and more into gut flora and assimilation of nutrients. I mean, it's just going to, in my opinion, just going to give more and more support towards like, hey, your best bet right now is to understand what your body needs. And yes, we can incorporate external information to a degree, but ultimately, like, you are the one that's driving the car. You are the one that has to know how to turn the wheel. Like you're the one that has to know how to push on the brake. Like I've been giving this analogy a lot of like, even if you might jump from car to car and the brake and the pedal might be different, but you have to learn how to drive like your own body. You have to know how to navigate regardless of what diagnosis you have or whatever's going on. Ultimately, you're still living in your body.
Right. Oh, it's so true. And the car analogy is such a good one too, because I think about that metaphor, like food is fuel, like when you're fueling up a car, nobody says like, okay, I have to get it to this exact amount of gallons. I mean, unless you're like, I only have this much money and I'm going to put this much money in or something. But like putting that aside, no one's like looking to fill up their car with an exact amount of fuel. They're looking to just fill it till it's full and the thing clicks and it's like, okay, we're good. It's full.
Yeah. Must be full.
Right. And, in the same way, it's like we paying attention to these things like calories or whatever. It's just so arbitrary. Like, why would we trust that more than just sort of noticing when our own click happens? And it's like, oh, okay, I'm full, and learning to tune into that.
Yeah.
And not judging it if, one day it takes more to fill it up than another day, or one day you get full faster, like, again, it's like you wouldn't do that with a car. You kind of have a sense of the gauge and be like, oh, it's probably about time to get some gas, but that's going to be sooner or later, depending on lots of other circumstances, like how far you've driven, how far to the next station, like whatever.
How you drive.
Exactly. Yeah. How like full your tires are. Like there's so many arbitrary little things that you can't control, which is so much like the human body. Like if you're under stress or if you're sick or you're moving more or you're moving less and micro movements, not like movements that you intentionally do or track, but just like things that you don't even notice, like that can all affect your appetite. So yeah, trying to control it is just pointless.
Right. And I'm actually glad I brought up that analogy right now, because for me too, right around that time is when I really started to realize, or I guess what I had been living my whole college years and some of my high school years was like I was in the driver's seat, but there was a backseat driver sitting next to me. And the backseat driver was the diet. And the diet was giving me lots of really reasonable suggestions, many of which came from my education. But ultimately, the way I translated that and the way it felt in my body and the way I drove my car, like it did not work. It wasn't going to meet my needs. And so I love this analogy. I came up with it like a couple of years ago and I started talking about it only recently, but it's so the backseat driver, no matter how reasonable that information is, they're still not going to be the best one to get around the corner or to know when to speed up or to know when to press on the brake. Like ultimately you can take some of that information or you can get like support from someone who's sitting in the car that says like, hey, it's raining. There's a turn coming up. Are you doing okay? Do you need it? You can do it. Right. And then you have to say like, yeah, I can do it. And ultimately I'm in the driver's seat. So I have to be the one who actually does it. really, we have to start talking about our bodies in that way of, I mean, all of us do. That's what we do every day, but at least in this field.
Right.
But yeah, that was that transition.
And like we have to do it on behalf of our clients and teach them how to do it because no one's teaching, a lot of diet culture is teaching them the opposite. So relearning how to do that is so important.
Exactly. So we can sit there and say, typically, and when it's raining and you're coming up on a curve, typically one would need to press on the brake about 25%, progressing to 50% or something. You might give them some feedback, but hey, how does that feel for you? And that's like the real difference of like, but how does that feel for you when you're doing that, when you're carrying out that instruction? Does that feel like it's not enough brake? Does that feel like it's too much brake? Do you feel like you need to turn that wheel sooner?
I love that.
Basically, long story long, basically, that was one of my big turning points. Kind of funny, really simple. But another turning point was I was a diet tech in a hospital between my education and my internship. And it just came to me after working with an elderly client who she had had a stroke, and unfortunately it had paralyzed half of her body. And I was in the room when the dietitian was giving instruction on the tube feed to her daughter. And the woman, her main concern that she could barely express was, is this going to make me gain weight? Mm. And it just killed me. And I remember thinking, like, it was just so heartbreaking for obvious reasons. And I just realized, like, I don't want that to be my concern if that unfortunately is what, happens to me in the future. And do I want to be looking back on my life thinking I wish I had eaten more chocolate chip cookies? Like, I don't, like, that's just not what I want for myself. And I finally started just letting myself eat. I'd never heard of intuitive eating, but which is funny, I've heard many stories go this way. I just started letting myself eat. Then I became a dietetic intern and worked with Katie Bartels in Orange County. And she's friends with Evelyn. They have offices that are close to each other. And so she had me read Intuitive Eating. And I mean, it just synced in right away. I had like one question about what if somebody wants fast food every day? That was like my dietetic intern, like one response of like, well, how does it work if somebody says that? And she just started talking about, well, how would that feel, in your body? And is that really something you would want every single day? And, kind of talked through that with me. And I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I just never looked back, never, ever, ever looked back after that. It was just, it aligned so well for me and became a huge passion. And eventually it wasn't my first role that I got to, well, I worked for an elementary school district as my first role as a dietitian, but then worked for an eating disorder program after that. And now I'm in private practice.
Yeah, that's exciting. How was where did sort of health at every size and the non-diet, I mean, intuitive eating is a non-diet approach, but the sort of weight neutral approach and the health at every size message, did that come when you first read intuitive eating? Did that come later?
Really good question. I'm glad you brought that up. So I unfortunately didn't put it as much together as I could have in the beginning. So I read intuitive eating, totally hopped on the train of using our internal cues and, all of the messages in the book. But at the time, this was I want to say this was the first edition, maybe the second edition. And I hadn't quite adopted throughout the entire book the health at every size model. And I was still learning about that part. And so when I was in my master's program, I remember somebody getting up and talking about health at every size. And my friend, Wendy Jo Peterson, who was in the class with me together, she's another dietitian in San Diego. She turned to me and she's like, oh, this is your thing. Oh. And I was like, what? Because she knew I was like gung ho about intuitive eating. She's like, these are your people. Like, like,
that's so cool.
I just wasn't, it just wasn't. Sometimes I think back on things that like didn't connect for me. I'm like, how did that not connect? But basically that was the turning point.
Yeah. No, I asked the question because it was the same for me. It didn't connect right away. And I think that's the case for a lot of dietitians. I think it's like, you can sort of make a leap into intuitive eating, but even, I mean, I think I read, because I read it in like 2009 or something and applied it to my own life. And that edition, I think that was the third edition, and it had the non-diet or the health at every size messages sort of infused, but it wasn't like explicitly spelled out. I think maybe there was one box on one page about health at every size or something, but I just was like not really taking it in and didn't sort of, I guess because my own weight bias and the weight bias of the dietetic training, at that point was so strong in me. I was like it just was sort of bouncing off. And so it wasn't until I started working with eating disorders and going to eating disorder conferences that I was like, oh, this is the science. Like this, it sort of seems like the best practices for treating eating disorders is a health at every size approach for everyone. And that makes total sense. And so it clicked, like the first big conference I went to, but I was probably getting all of these messages along the way that were sort of just glancing off me because I wasn't fully ready to accept it yet. And I think that's pretty common in diet culture. Like, because even if you go through your own experience of making peace with food and learning to eat intuitively for yourself, there's all this messaging out there that's like, but in these particular cases, like people still need to lose weight for medical reasons, quote unquote. And I get still a lot of questions like that, even with the podcast and all the anti-diet and health at every size work I do, which I feel like I'm pretty explicit about, but maybe sometimes new listeners start listening and they haven't heard episodes that are quite, that spell it out quite as much. But I'm like, I'm super all about health at every size. And yet I get a lot of requests from potential clients who are like, I need to lose weight for my health. And, I want to do it in a health at every size way. And it's like, do you see the disconnect there? Like that is a disconnect, but I think it's not quite, I don't know. I think it just takes a lot to break down that weight bias that is so internalized in our culture.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And one of the hardest parts for our clients to break through.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is just it's everywhere.
And like doctors and, a lot of medical professionals or other dietitians that they've seen before or whatever will reinforce that. Even some eating disorder treatment centers, unfortunately, reinforce that, which is maddening.
It's incredibly frustrating. Yeah, to go to conferences and things like that and to continue to hear these comments, which I'll say, thankfully, people are speaking up about it. I like for myself to do that more. I'm hearing much more pushback or questions that are oriented to body inclusivity, asked very intentionally at conferences much more often than I heard years ago.
Yeah.
So I do think the health at every size message is like slowly breaking through. But there are days where I feel like, oh, everything's things are really progressing, and there are other days where I'm like,
it's the worst.
Still here,
Yeah.
It is so hard, and particularly too, if we talk a little bit about like pregnancy and postpartum and kind of skipping through to that.
Yeah. I really wanted to ask you about that too, like from your own experience of pregnancy and then also the work you do with clients. What do you see coming up for women who are going through that?
Yeah. From a body image perspective, and we actually see this in the research, it tends to be, certainly there are plenty of women struggling with body image and eating disorders during pregnancy, 5 to 7% with eating disorders, close to, depending on the research study you look at, around 30% struggling with some level of disordered eating. But the fact is it gets even worse during postpartum. So I think as a medical community, there's a lot, like during pregnancy, women get a lot of care and everyone's focused on them, probably too much, and we are meeting with our doctors, as we get closer to childbirth, or we're meeting with them every week, and we really know this person. And then we birth our babies, and the focus immediately goes to the baby, and we're kind of left high and dry. Like, it's pretty wild to go through the birth experience, wherever way you birth, and to have someone say, okay, we'll see ya in 6 weeks. Congratulations. And you're just like, what? Like this baby was inside of me. Everything was going fine. He wanted to see me every week. All of a sudden now, like you were there, you saw that birth, right? Like, don't you want to make sure everything goes okay for the next 6 weeks? Like there are huge holes in our medical care. And from a cultural perspective, how we're prepared for the transition into motherhood and parenthood, there are just so many holes. I know on a personal level, like I had, talked about before, the classes that are offered, typically, there are some people who are doing this differently, but the classic prep classes are like how to swaddle, how to change the diaper. Great. If you feel like, certainly swaddling is not super intuitive, it's helpful to learn, but you're going to be okay if you can't swaddle your baby. Like, you're not going to be as okay if you're suffering from postpartum depression and your partner or your family doesn't know how to identify the signs of that. That's what we need to be talking about in these classes. That's what we need. We need to be talking about what is disordered eating. What does it sound like to talk about bodies in an inclusive way? What does it mean to provide good care to a mother who's healing from childbirth? Is it best that we have a bajillion visitors coming over? And, would you do that to someone after a surgery? No. Like, when you have a surgery, maybe people are helping you, they're bringing you food, but they're not probably bombarding you with visits. They understand you're in a healing phase. So I just think there's a huge shift that needs to happen. And we need to recognize that we're really reinforcing all of the things you and I have talked about in this podcast. When we tell moms like, hey, you're not happy with your body or you're feeling uncomfortable, I know how to help you change that by going on this diet or using this perfect meal plan or taking these shakes or whatever it is. It's just that one more time in our lives where that is completely reinforced, and the disordered eating piece is so normalized because it's encouraged. I mean, it really is encouraged in so many ways.
It's so normal to be uncomfortable at that point because your body has just gone through something insane, like major, it's a major change, and it is kind of like surgery where you have to heal and recuperate, and to feel uncomfortable in your body and sort of be learning this new body and how it works is such a normal part of the process. But when we tell people like, oh, well, this is normal and the way you fix it is through dieting or is through weight loss, like it's you're uncomfortable because your body is bigger and you need to make it smaller. That's really one of the key messages that people get, I think. And it's like, that's not why you're uncomfortable. That's not going to solve the problem. That's actually going to make everything worse. But it's so seductive to hear that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. That's been something I've been saying a good amount in the group that I run. Is like, hey, if you've just gone through your transition into motherhood, or you've just birthed a baby, or you're pregnant and you feel uncomfortable in your body, that is not abnormal. You only have one body. Like, you're living in this body and it changes and it interacts with the world differently. I'm not talking about necessarily, there's plenty of cultural responses that we get, but just in terms of like you said, just learning about these changes. Even going bra shopping can be frustrating, just trying to figure out what clothes are going to feel best, what's going to fit, all of that stuff, managing the budget around that. There's so many things. Like, of course you're going to feel uncomfortable. It's the way we talk about it, the next step, that makes it a problem, where exactly like, oh, you feel this way because of this, and you need to just be smaller and everything will get better, or get that body back, which I really truly believe is, yes, there's a lot like from a surface level perspective, but that message is, many of us feel when we transition into motherhood of like, okay, there's like, this is great. I love this kid more than anything I've ever loved in my entire life. I didn't even know I could love this much. And I don't know what I just did. My life is completely different. I don't recognize myself. I don't feel like myself. I can't even do typical things that came very easily to me prior. It can be very, very overwhelming. And so that, yes, that seductive message of like, hey, let's get your body back. And the lifelong message that we've received is, if you feel uncomfortable or you feel out of control, this is one way you can try to feel in control and feel more comfortable. Of course you would want it. And there's just a lot going on when you have a newborn. So I also see the draw to like, hey, here's a plan. You don't have to think about it. Just eat these things and you'll be good.
Yeah. Totally. It's that promise that is sold to us in so many different ways to take care of any ills that we experience. Like, it's the, what do they call it? It's like not aspirational marketing, but it's sort of like pushing on a pain point, or sometimes in some cases, like creating a pain point. Like, oh, did you know that this thing your body does normally is actually really messed up and you should make it stop, which like deodorant is sort of a classic example of that. It's like, you're not supposed to smell bad. You need to buy this product to fix, this unseemly thing that your body is doing. And that's not to say I'm going to stop wearing deodorant anytime soon, but like, that is how this product and the marketplace for deodorants developed. Was we were told that natural function of our body was wrong, and here's a product that can fix it. And it happens in so many different ways. And I think diets and weight loss are such a common way that happens. And any sort of natural human issue or time of discomfort or a time of transition and change is like, we're ripe, we're vulnerable for those kinds of messages to get us. And I think that marketers sort of know that.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's not totally innocent, the way that women are sold diets and like the get your body back message in postpartum. It's like, that is a time of struggle and difficulty, and people are vulnerable. And so those messages are really preying on people, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. That message isn't that old. I mean, it's a fairly recent thing to be really kind of preying on like pregnant and postpartum women, and making their bodies a problem yet again during this phase. It's a time where we so dearly need to learn to connect and be in our bodies. We always need that, but especially during this time of great change. But again, I think we're taught that that's too uncomfortable, And so when you go through this really big shift, the default is disconnect. When we really need to be sending messages that would help us reconnect and learn and be in touch with what's going on through this change. Yeah.
Well, tell us more about your work in this arena. Like, what do you do to help women reconnect in that time?
Yeah. So right now, well, of course, I have work that I do with women one-to-one, and I also have an online program. Right now, it's mainly an online community, the Nurtured Mama community. And so this is just a space. I mean, I call it a body positive wellness community for moms and moms-to-be. It's a place to introduce all of these topics because, I realized going through my own experiences with postpartum depression and anxiety and realizing just how much I went through during my experience that one, I really saw firsthand how vulnerable we can be to disordered eating. I went into it with a very healthy relationship with food, and I think that was very protective for me. Definitely affected my eating to a degree in terms of like, if I was anxious, I might eat faster or something like that. But I was able to really sit with that and be like, oh, look at that. Like, that's interesting without judgment. And I think that was a huge shift. And I felt like, gosh, I really want to take my skill set and make sure that I'm not the only one benefiting from this.
Yeah.
Like, you can go through something that's really, really hard and it not dramatically impact your eating. And you don't have to diet. Like, that doesn't have to be the only option. So the intention with this group is really to create that safe space to have these conversations and to decrease the stigma around it. I get a lot of questions of like, well, how are people dealing with the vulnerability of like opting into that group and talking about these things? Because it is a little bit different than, like, I know with your group, people know what they're getting into. Like, when they join the group, they're like, yeah, I've been listening to the podcast. This rocks. Like, I'm totally interested in this and I want to join. And I think in my group, it's not necessarily as obvious, and people have never even heard of it because they might not have found it via a podcast or whatnot. And so it's really a place to talk about wellness through a body inclusivity, motherhood transition lens. And that's how I do, with the work that I do with clients. Of course, we use the experience that children have. We like to use a lot of those parallels in terms of their ability to regulate their intake and the very neutral way that they experience their bodies at a very young age before they get all of the cultural impact, and use that as, an example of what that could be like or could look like, and really look at the client if I'm working with a client one-to-one, look at the disordered eating and the thought patterns around the eating experiences through the lens of motherhood. Again, like the parallels between the transition and the disconnection and the importance of reconnecting during that time. And I love, I use the car analogy a lot lately.
It's such a good one.
Yes. But I just think it's important when we're working with mothers and parents in general to be able to speak about it through this lens. I think that can be a powerful way of looking at it and unveiling, I think, some things that are going on that might be missed had we not looked at it through that perspective.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too that for some people that might be their first introduction to intuitive eating and size acceptance. Maybe they've gone through their whole life with sort of that low-level body dissatisfaction, disordered eating that so many women experience. And so getting to the point of pregnancy and postpartum and thinking about things from that lens, maybe this is an opportunity to really address some of the issues that have been with them their whole lives.
Right. And I think if they have struggled with food and body to any degree, they might be thinking, I really don't want this for my children. And we, to a degree, don't have control over that.
Yeah.
But
genetics.
To a degree we can. Yeah. Good old genetics, and our culture. And, but we can also, I think that is part of what sparks the interest, because they're kind of thinking like, I want this for my kids, but I'm not quite sure how to do this for myself yet. And yeah, this group is going to continue to evolve, obviously. And I'm about to launch some group coaching programs to get more into the nitty-gritty for people who want to dive deeper. But I think it's also a space where people can get exposed to the topics and they can come as they are. So you don't have to be on the non-diet bandwagon to join the group. But if you have an interest in that, this is the place for you. I don't want people to feel like every question they ask has to be asked in this quote, perfect way. This is there's a lot that I have the privilege of knowing as a professional in this field who's been spending a lot of time learning about these things that other people, that's just not their area of study and expertise. And we all live in the same world. And so I want everyone to feel like they can ask certain questions and bring up certain topics and, feel like this is a space where we can really talk through some of those things. Of course, if there's, we also keep an eye on triggering content and numbers, and we definitely manage that. But I really want this to be, I would love for this to become the norm. There are a lot of wellness groups. I think what I'm trying to say, there's a lot of wellness groups. There's no vulnerability in joining those wellness groups. They have 20,000 people in their group.
Right.
And they're all talking about, their dieting and their plans. And there's no vulnerability there. I mean, look at Instagram. There's before and after pictures like crazy. So it's just so interesting that when you say, let's be body inclusive, let's tell people that their bodies are okay the way they are. And let's kind of bring some of this out of the closet, so to speak, in terms of hey, most of us are dealing to some degree with some body image stuff. Most of us to some degree have dealt with dieting and some thoughts about food that are not necessarily something you have to live with. Doesn't mean you have an eating disorder, but we live in this world.
Yeah.
Or to a degree, we're probably affected. And this shouldn't have to feel super vulnerable to, in theory, to join a group like that, to have that discussion, basically. But at the same time, I 100% understand the vulnerability factor involved with it as well. So I'm trying to be very sensitive to that, obviously.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because I think it is kind of there's a certain armor around that diet culture gives you. If you're buying into diet culture and you're like, I have this problem with my body and I want to change it, I'm going to try this diet. That's keeping the armor around you. You don't have to look at the underlying issues. You don't have to look at what's really going on with the body dissatisfaction or why you think your body is wrong. It's sort of just skating by into the purported solution, which of course is not a solution. But when you have to actually take off that armor and take away that sort of reflexive supposed fix for the discomfort and just feel the discomfort and look at why you think your body is a problem, that's very vulnerable. For sure. We spend so much time trying to outrun that, and so sitting in it and doing that work is tough.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I hope nothing I said made that seem like I didn't
Oh, no.
agree with that. But kind of zooming out and thinking of it in terms of the social aspect of that. And one of those areas is so normalized and the other one is so not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's such a common way that people go for such a long time. It's like, oh, you feel like your body's wrong. Here's the fix, here, try this new thing. Oh, that didn't work. Try this other new thing. Keep trying, keep at it. Like do all the things, and instead the size acceptance, body acceptance movement is asking you to like not do and to be with and to comfort and give yourself compassion and kind of uncover and unravel what is underneath this body dissatisfaction that has so little to do with you as an individual. A lot of it is culturally conditioned, and individuals can be subject to it and buy into it to a certain degree, but it's coming from somewhere. Like we don't just end up with these issues in a vacuum, like we were saying earlier. It's all part of this larger diet culture that we live in.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, tell us where people can find you and learn more about your programs.
Sure. So people can find me on my website is nutritioninstincts.com. And I also have another website called thenurturedmama.club. So you can learn more about the Nurtured Mama either there or there's a subpage on nutritioninstincts.com. It's very obvious when you go to the homepage, you can click on the Nurtured Mama and read more about it there. And then of course the Facebook group, if you Google the Nurtured Mama community, that group should pop up and you can request to join. And then Instagram, Nutrition Instincts is my handle. Same with Facebook.
Awesome. Yeah, awesome. Well, I'll link to all those in the show notes too, so people can find you. And thank you so much for sharing your story today. It's been really wonderful.
Thanks, Christy. I really appreciate you having me on. And I just love what you're doing. You should be so proud of yourself for the podcast you've created and the movement you're keeping going.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. So that's our show. Thanks again so much to our guest for being here and to you guys for listening. And we'll be back again next week with another brand new episode. Meanwhile, I'd love to stay in touch. And the best way to do that is via email. So you can go to christyharrison.com/email to sign up for my VIP list. I'll send you info about new episodes of the podcast as they drop, as well as exclusive sneak previews of new episodes, giveaways and other special deals on the products and services I offer, special tips on how to make peace with food and learn to trust your body, and a whole lot more. Sign up at christyharrison.com/email. You can also subscribe via iTunes and leave us a nice rating and review, which is a great way to get the word out about the podcast and help other people find these important messages. Just go to iTunes from your computer or your podcasts app, type in Food Psych to the search bar, click on the result that comes up under podcasts, and then click on ratings and reviews, and you can leave a rating and review right there. And I really appreciate all the 5-star reviews and wonderful ratings that we've gotten because it's helped us climb really high right now in the rankings. And that's really cool because we're competing against some of the weight management and body shaming types of messages that I'm trying to fight with this podcast. So we've really started to beat out a lot of the diety voices, and I'd love to continue climbing higher in the rankings to get this message out even further. So please leave us a nice rating and review. It's so very much appreciated, and thanks to everyone who's left reviews so far. The music you're hearing behind me now is by a band called AWOL, and the track is called Food, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.
Stupid or scared, no work in the kitchen now. Who put you there in that perfect position now? Bullies want your food, and you ain't really beef. Have you ever